Good evening. Close your eyes. Let yourself drift, gently, softly, back to the summer of 1518. The air is thick, heavy as wet wool, and everything smells faintly of smoke and damp straw. The sun is already angry overhead, and no one has the energy for small talk. A woman steps out of her narrow wooden home. No one notices her at first. Why would they? She's not remarkable, not royalty, not mad, not a prophet, just Frau. That's all we get for a name. Frau Trafia. History didn't bother. She probably had one, but that got lost somewhere between the sweating scribes and the plagues and the years. We're in Strasbourg, a modest town curled into the elbow of the Rhine River, where the cobbled streets are hot enough to blister bare feet, and the silence is always pregnant with some new kind of dread. The world is smaller here, slower, quieter, but inside that quiet, things are stirring. Now picture this. It's an ordinary morning, one of those slow brewing ones where even the birds can't be bothered. She walks into the middle of the street, as if to fetch water or stretch her back. Another woman whose arms jerked wildly as if she were fighting off invisible wasps, jerking, twitching, frothing at the mouth. Some weeping, some screaming, some so far gone their faces were blank as the sky, and always moving. And then a dozen, 24 dozens, men and women alike, spinning and stomping and collapsing in the streets, young, old, thin, sick. It didn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't picky. But what we do know, what the surviving notes and letters confirm, is that this was no isolated fit. They gathered around, leaning from windows and stoops, whispering prayers or crossing themselves, or simply staring, as if by looking hard enough they might understand it, or catch it. It wasn't a party, or a cult, or a prank. It was something else entirely. They asked, who sinned? What spirit did we anger? Is this the work of God, or something much darker? The stink of sweat and rot in the air. Imagine the sound, not music, but bodies moving, feet scraping stone, clothes snapping. Others claimed they could hear music no one else could hear, melodies rising from the bones of the city, ancient and irresistible, and a few said they heard nothing at all, just silence inside their minds, as if the world had gone away and left only their limbs to carry on. The occasional thud of someone falling, the wet gasp of someone trying to speak through a locked jaw. No order, no melody, just movement, raw, relentless movement. Not after the sun crosses the sky and begins to fall again behind the crooked rooftops of the city. Some collapsed, only to stand again, hours later, still moving, still possessed, confused, to put it politely. You'd think they'd try something simple. Water, quarantine, maybe a firm stop that, but no. This is 1518, a 4th century martyr said to protect against epilepsy, animal bites, and inexplicable twitching. Convenient, isn't it? Some said the dancers were cursed by him for their lack of reverence. Others thought they were possessed and needed to be led to a shrine to dance the demons out. And the thinking is, let's call it Baroque. There They bathed their feet in holy water and offered sacrifices. Some say that helped, others say it only spread the spectacle further. Back then, ailments weren't caused by bacteria or brain chemistry. They were the result of cosmic imbalance, bad blood, evil spirits, or, of course, a heavy dose of sin. And this, whatever this was, looked like divine punishment with jazz hands. No one knew what to do. Not the priests, not the town doctors, not the city council. And still more people kept joining. Bless them. Took one look at the situation and declared the cause obvious. Overheating of the blood. Logically, the city, they played lute and fiddle while people collapsed in front of them. Some of them probably thought they were helping. Others just needed the money. Imagine that scene. A string quartet playing politely while a man in rags dies mid-somersault. It's the kind of surreal performance that would make Dolly blush. And yet, to the people of Strasbourg, this was treatment. This was care. Officials took their advice and made the most brilliant decision of the decade. They built a stage. The heart, you see, was far too excited, too warm, as expected, had a very different opinion. Not because of passion. Priests began holding special masses to pray away the frenzy. They blamed everything from astrology to heresy to you. Guessed it, women. It was always a woman's fault. A sinful body, a weak spirit. Maybe too much dancing at home. Maybe Frau Trafia had invited the devil in through her feet. The logic didn't have to make sense. It just had to feel righteous. No, don't be ridiculous, but because of an internal imbalance that made people ... dance. And the only cure? Let it burn itself out. Let the body move until the blood cooled. Like sweating out a fever, only with more bruises and broken teeth. By the end of the first week, the numbers had swelled to over 30. By the end of the month, some say there were hundreds. An actual, physical platform. They cleared the grain hall. They hired musicians. They even paid dancers to keep the crowd going, thinking that if they leaned into the madness, fed it with flutes and drums, it might burn faster, like a bonfire stacked too high. She keeps dancing, eyes wide, face pale, feet moving. You have to understand the setting to really feel the weight of what's happening here. Strasbourg 1518 was not a place built for mystery. It was a city already drowning in trouble. The plague was a frequent visitor. So was famine. Not just gossiping, whispering the way you do when you think something might be listening. She's become a kind of landmark. Turn left at the market, past the butcher's stall, just before the woman who won't stop dancing, that sort of thing. Most people were barely scraping by. Bread was scarce. Water often worse than nothing. The street is starting to fill with others' bodies lurching in rhythmless, ceaseless motion. There's no pattern to it, no shared choreography. This isn't a performance. It's a plague without pus, an infection of movement. Men twist like they've stepped on hot coals. Girls spin until they fall and bleed. Old women sway with tears rolling down their cheeks. Some are barely conscious. Others are wide-eyed and frantic, as if begging their own legs to stop. But none of them can. The Rhine ran thick with filth, and through it all, religion held everything together like badly stitched cloth. Not the comforting kind of religion, either. Not soft candlelight and kind words. This was medieval, fire and brimstone belief. Sins were everywhere. Demons lurked under your floorboards. Illness wasn't just bad luck, it was divine punishment, or worse, possession. Her shoes fall apart by the second day, and by the third, her feet are raw and blistered. Her dress is soaked through, and still she moves. And then, without any warning, without any sound, she begins to dance. She wasn't twirling like some kind of woodland nymph. She looked haunted, desperate, like her body had broken free from her mind and decided to rebel. People offered her bread, water, a place to lie down. But none of it worked. She danced through fatigue, through hunger, through pain. Sleep? Not really. Maybe little collapses here and there, but nothing that would make sense to the human body. No restoration, no relief. Her arms flail, her legs jerk, her body moving like something inside it snapped. It isn't graceful or joyful or even rhythmic. It looks like she's being pulled by invisible wires. Her neighbors pause, one by one. A man with a basket of eels slows to watch. A mother shields her child's eyes. Someone mutters a prayer. Because this is wrong. There's no music, no beat. And she doesn't stop. Not after 10 minutes. Not after 2 hours. They say she wasn't smiling. That's important. And here's where things tip from eerie to impossible, because others started to join her. At first, it was just a few. A man who twitched uncontrollably as he walked. A girl who began to sway and mutter. Imagine that. A summer afternoon where the town square is filled with bodies, not lying dead but dancing, not with joy, but with terror. Now, let's step back for a moment. So when Frau Trophia started dancing, and when others began to fall into the same strange trance, people didn't ask questions like, is this neurological? Or could it be something in the food? And to be fair, it looked dark. The dancers didn't respond to pain. They didn't seem to rest. Of course, no one agrees on the exact number. Medieval record-keeping was more rumor than ledger. And here's the part that should make you shiver a little. People watched. They watched like it was a show. Because fear is contagious, but so is fascination. Now imagine you're there. Imagine the heat. Some said the dancers saw things, apparitions, glimpses of heaven or hell. Strasbourg had seen plague, famine, war. But this was new. This was unthinkable. And all of it every wild, surreal sec of it began with one woman. Frau, more than a week has passed, and people are whispering now. But it's no longer just her. The town's leaders are the local physicians. So, not metaphorically, and burn it did. The musicians showed up in good faith. The church, they were less interested in overheating blood and more concerned with burning souls. Others pointed fingers at saints, or more specifically, the lack of proper devotion to one particular saint, Saint Vitus. So they tried that too. They gathered the afflicted, packed them up, and marched them dancing all the while toward a mountain-top chapel. Meanwhile, the townspeople were caught between fear and voyeurism. It's hard to know how much empathy survived those first few days. There's a point where shock curdles into fascination, and fascination turns cold. People brought their children to watch. Merchants set up stalls near the worst of the chaos. Wine was sold. Bread passed around. You could watch a woman bleed through her shoes and then buy a nice apple tart on your way home. Humans are resilient and deeply, profoundly weird. And what of Frau Trafia? She disappeared, in a way, faded back into the crowd she started. Some say she was carried off in a cart, still convulsing. Others claim she danced herself to death. But the truth is, no one really knows. She slips out of the records as quietly as she entered. A ghost in her own story. One woman, one moment, one spark that lit a fire under an entire town's feet. But if this story seems too strange to be real, too theatrical, to nightmarish, remember this. Strasbourg's dancing plague wasn't the first or the last of its kind. It was just the most vivid, the best documented. Maybe because the scribes couldn't believe it either. When it isn't play or music or joy, just motion that doesn't belong to them anymore. Most of them rose again, eyes distant, skin flushed, moving with the mechanical rhythm of something no longer alive in the normal sense. They swayed like sleepwalkers. They spun like lovers in a dream they couldn't wake from. They bled. They moaned. They sweated through their clothes. Frau Trafia whispered some had been cursed. Others said she'd committed some unspoken crime. Too many eclipses. Too much Saturn. Not enough mercy. They prescribed movement, ironically, whether out of sympathy, madness, or something darker, who knows. People crave belonging, even if it's too horror. A woman with no family, a man with no work, perhaps a little sway, a little twitch, and suddenly you're part of something. Seen, tended to, even feared. Fear has gravity. It draws attention like nothing else. They danced until their hearts gave out, until their muscles tore, until they cracked their skulls on stone. The records don't always agree on the number. Some say dozens, others hundreds. There were murmurs about cures, herbs, leeches, pilgrimages, but nothing stuck. Nothing worked. The dancers kept dancing. The flutists kept playing. The city kept sweating. But whether it was 10 or 100, the truth is, they died with their feet moving. Similar outbreaks had flared up in the centuries before, though none quite this dramatic. It was another to see your neighbor foaming at the mouth while spinning in circles for 3 days straight. Especially when he used to mock such things. Especially when you feel your own leg twitching now. Just a little, in the dead of night. There had been spasms of dancing elsewhere in Okan, in the Netherlands, even in Bern. But this... this was different. This was sustained. This was virulent. This was undeniable. Death did not come as a release. It came mid-step, mid-lurch, mid-gasp. One moment, motion. The next, stillness. They argued that resisting the dance would only make it worse. The dancers became ... a fact, a constant. People walked around them, lived around them, built routines around the twitching mass in the square. The extraordinary became ordinary, as if the city itself had entered a trance, lulled by the rhythmic thump of bodies hitting stone. The affliction didn't come all at once. It moved in waves, like fever dreams. Some fell quickly, others watched 4 days before joining. One man sold protective boots lined with lamb's wool, promising that if the madness came for your feet, it would at least find them comfortable. A woman offered to pray the dance away for a silver coin, though she herself had a twitch that never quite went away. A few lucky or cursed, depending on who you ask, watched, and never moved at all. Let it pass, they said. Let them sweat it out. This wasn't just a village's nervous breakdown. It wasn't just superstition spun into chaos. It was grief. Grief made visible. Grief that had run out of tears and decided to speak through trembling limbs instead. And so the dance continued. Sanctioned, observed, polished into performance, or that she'd summoned the devil, and now he danced inside her skin. It didn't take much to fan the flames of paranoia. A single priest's sermon, poorly worded, a sick cow found twitching near the square, a woman muttering in her sleep about fire and music and feet that wouldn't stop moving. The stories fed on each other. They grew tall and crooked, like trees left too long in the dark. The crushing weight of being alive in a world that seemed determined to punish the living. It all gathered in their bones, and the bones decided to move, to scream without sound, to cry without words. Some bit their own tongues until they choked on blood. Some simply screamed. It didn't seem to matter what class they came from. The fever danced between peasants and burghers alike, as if wealth had nothing to offer against madness. It forces the mind to ask questions it doesn't want to answer. What happens when the body becomes a puppet? When will the string snap? And what if it catches you next? Maybe because they needed to write it down just to prove it happened. Or maybe they, too, were trying to make sense of something senseless, because no one dances themselves to death without reason. The musicians played, and the dancers danced, through dust and blood and prayers and silence. A strange choreography, unfolding not across a stage but across the bruised face of a city already teetering at the edge of despair. And so the city watched. The priests prayed. The dancing did not stop. If anything, it gained momentum. As more feet joined the cruel choreography, the city began to warp around it. Bakers stopped baking. Merchants left their stalls unattended. Children grew quiet. Nothing seemed more urgent than the ever-growing circle of bodies twisting under the summer sun. And yet, it was only beginning. The days turned molten. Dust clung to everything, the kind of dust that found its way into your teeth and settled behind your eyes, and no one could look away. There's something horrifyingly magnetic about watching people move when they shouldn't. The dancers collapsed. Frequently, but collapsing was only a brief intermission, and still the city tried to manage it, with all the elegance of a man trying to wrestle fog. Somewhere, amid the chaos, rumors began to stretch their legs. Others tried to stay practical. There were doctors who still insisted it was the heat, or spoiled blood, or celestial misalignment. There were whispers that some people pretended to be affected, but not everyone had the luxury of pretending. People began to die. Not quietly, not in beds, in the streets. The strange thing is, even as the horror deepened, the story began to sink into the marrow of the city. Some families began to hide their afflicted, ashamed, afraid. Others paraded theirs to the square, desperate for help, or perhaps simply out of resignation. And above it all, the sky remained perfectly indifferent. What the people of Strasbourg didn't know is that this was not the first time Europe had twitched beneath invisible music. Even the skeptics began to falter. A dancing plague was one thing on parchment. Something in the air, maybe. Something in the bread. Possibly something in the blood. Almost certainly. But not the kind they could see. It was, by this point, impossible to tell how many dancers were left from the original group, or how many were new. And there were those who began to profit. Yes, even here. Even now, vendors hawked charms to ward off the curse. Musicians charged extra for funerals, citing dancers' rates, because fear is profitable. Always has been. And yet, beneath the absurdity, beneath the grotesque poetry of it all, was something deeper, something more raw. The plague, the famine, the endless struggle. It made no sense, and yet it made perfect sense. Because what else do you do when nothing makes sense anymore? You dance, until your feet bleed, until the silence comes, until someone, somewhere, remembers your name. Even if history forgets your face, even if all that's left is motion. It started with one woman, but it didn't stay that way. As July unfurled over Strasbourg like a fevered blanket, the steps multiplied, first by tens, then by dozens. Then they stopped counting, because the dance had gone viral, in the most medieval sense possible. No screens, no hat, just the trembling sight of your neighbour collapsing mid-jig in the marketplace, mouth frothing, knees buckling, head tilted toward the sky like it might offer mercy. Some said it looked like fits, others swore it looked like ecstasy, a kind of warped religious trance. If God were a cruel choreographer, one merchant said the afflicted moved as if dragged by invisible strings. Another compared them to marionettes possessed by devils. The strangest thing of all, musicians were brought in from nearby towns, drummers, fiddlers, paid in coin to serenade the madness. Imagine the absurdity of that. A small orchestra performing while a woman convulses to death in the dirt. But this was considered therapeutic. Let the sickness burn out. Let them dance until the illness danced itself away. Many of them didn't seem to want to stop. It didn't. Not every household had a dancer, but every household knew one. Families sent for priests. He tried to keep the economy going. Tried to keep bread in the bakeries and wine in the barrels, but people stopped buying. They stopped working. Crowds gather not just out of horror, but out of something deeper. A sense of doom, softened by spectacle. People brought stools, sat under umbrellas, ate roasted nuts while a man twitched himself unconscious near the butcher's stall. Maybe that was why the dance wouldn't stop, because the air itself was infected. It smelled of sweat. incense, meat left too long in the sun, and beneath all of that, a smell no one wanted to name. The sharp, sweet rot of dying bodies that couldn't keep up with their own bones. The city square began to feel like a warped theatre, and the show never stopped. But even the musicians began to falter. Some refused to play, others broke down in tears during performances. One flutist went home after a long day's playing, only to find his own daughter swaying in their doorway, eyes blank, dress torn at the hem. Some even stopped speaking, as if fearing that words themselves might carry the rhythm. Then physicians, then both at once. When neither helped, they tried charms, saints, and sacrificial offerings. Some burned herbs in their doorways. Others smeared lamb's blood over thresholds. A few abandoned their homes altogether, convinced the devil had taken up residence. They came in waves. A baker's wife with flour still on her hands. Others seemed struck all at once, as though lightning had leaped from another's convulsing limbs directly into their spine. The Bishop of Strasbourg, exasperated and likely terrified, ordered that the afflicted be taken to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus actors, and, apparently, those cursed to twirl themselves into oblivion. The theory went that by walking the dancers, or rather dragging them to this holy site, the spirit of Vitus would cure them. Theories evolved with the chaos. One doctor suggested that the afflicted had overheated the soul, a condition he believed could only be cured by cooling rituals. Others stumbled there under their own failing strength, feet bleeding, mouths whispering things no one could understand. They were made to kneel, to pray, to fast, to be sprinkled with holy water, in hopes that whatever had claimed them would finally let go. Another proposed bloodletting, but found that the dancers wouldn't hold still long enough to be properly sliced. On one hand, they feared divine punishment if they mishandled the plague. On the other, they feared being mocked by other towns, by their rivals, by history itself. It sounds absurd now because it was absurd then. These makeshift dance floors became miniature theaters of suffering. People gathered around them, not with joy or curiosity, but with dread. A few flung themselves from rooftops, seeking stillness, the only way left. Their deaths did not end the dancing. In some twisted way, they seemed to intensify it, like grief echoing through bone. You could see it in their eyes. This was not performance. A girl who danced beside her mother until the mother dropped and then kept going. A boy who stood beside his convulsing father, mimicking the movements out of fear or love or both, until the mimicry became real and he, too, could not stop. That the ground under Strasbourg had become hollow, a drumhead stretched tight by something ancient. Every theory was half-whispered. Usually at night, when the air grew thick and the drums in the distance never quite stopped, families dissolved under the weight of motion, marriages fractured, friendships turned into prayer circles or accusations. One man locked his wife in the cellar after she began to hum a melody in her sleep. She danced in the dark for 3 days before she died. It was possession. The idea that your people were literally dancing themselves to death didn't exactly attract trade or talent. And so, in a final effort to appear proactive, The city authorized even more musicians, even more public spaces, even more dancing platforms. No, they said, don't stop them. Encourage them. Give them space. Give them music. Give them a good time. People began to report odd phenomena. They heard music at night when there was none. The affliction was no longer just a city-wide. It had become a pilgrimage of pain. They felt their toes twitching under the covers. One man claimed the stones in his fireplace pulsed in time with an invisible beat. Another swore he saw his reflection dancing in the basin before his own body joined in. A blacksmith's apprentice who twitched so hard he cracked his shoulder on a wagon wheel, because in Strasbourg that summer disbelief had gone out of fashion. Some groaned as they moved. Others laughed high, wild laughter that had no joy in it at all, and some were utterly silent, their mouths open in a scream. They no longer had strength of voice. A miller who drank too much, a widow who never came to mass. As always, when logic fails, suspicion takes over. Teenagers with wide, confused eyes, grandmothers who should have been resting in shade, not spinning themselves raw on cobblestone. They danced in alleyways, in churchyards, in the town square, in front of the cathedral right, under the gaze of stone saints who stared blankly as the living twisted below. They screamed if pulled indoors, and when they collapsed, they often wept not from pain, but as if the music had stopped and they'd been left behind. Sometimes they danced in unison, like some mad ritual. Other times they thrashed out of sync. Chaos embodied. Eyewitnesses tried to describe it. But how do you describe something like that? They called it jerking, leaping, spasming. Whether driven by compulsion, exhaustion, or something darker, they resisted help. They shoved away hands that tried to restrain them. Doctors those, brave, confused souls kept, insisting it was overheating of the blood. The cure remained unchanged. More dancing, so the city doubled down. They cleared more areas in the marketplace. They hired bands to keep the beat going. It didn't. By now, the plague had overtaken nearly every district. The mayor, whose name history forgot, possibly out of mercy held meeting after meeting with the town council, trying to appear composed while people flailed outside like tangled puppets. Children were kept indoors, not just out of fear, but because more than one child had reportedly seen the dance and started moving. No one wanted to talk about that, and yet fascination remained. There's something almost magnetic about watching others lose control. A morbid curiosity. A few claimed it was punishment from above. Others whispered about secret sins. Whole families were accused. A merchant's wife, too pretty, and then there was the heat. That suffocating, sticky July heat that wrapped around the city like a wet shroud. It made the blood boil, or so they said. Still, the authorities clung to their strange solution. More musicians, bigger stages. Let them dance it out. The madness had stopped being metaphorical. It had roots now, and legs, and breath, and it moved through the city not like a disease, but like a storm. There were no maps for this, no rules, no borders, only feet, and blood, and music that no one could hear if Everyone followed, and the tempo was rising. The rhythm didn't stay confined to one square. It leaked, as all strange things do, into the alleys, into the chapels, into dreams. No one could prove these things, of course, but no one dared dismiss them either. More dancers emerged. Some joined slowly, as if testing the waters of madness. A shiver, a sway, a full-bodied jolt. Religious leaders offered their own ideas, most of which involved sin, suffering, and pain. Some were hauled to the shrine in wagons, convulsing and moaning all the way, and in some cases it worked. Or maybe they just collapsed from sheer exhaustion. But then new dancers appeared, fresh limbs, fresh agony. The shrine didn't solve the problem, it only displaced it. The city officials were now trapped between superstition and scandal. Yes, they built platforms, raised wooden stages in open areas, so the afflicted could express the illness more freely. And then came the heat-stroke deaths, the heart failures, the fractures, the suicides. Some hurled themselves into the river, others vanished into the woods, never to return. There were quieter tragedies too, and still no one could explain it. There were rumors that the city itself had been cursed, that someone had invoked a forgotten god, but not everyone was horrified. Somewhere between the flicker of candlelight and the shuffle of weary feet on ancient cobblestones, just pause with me for a moment, if you're still here, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Because it is deeply uncomfortable to believe that you could start dancing against your will and just never stop, that your own body could betray you so beautifully, so absurdly, so fatally. So the good citizens turned to what they knew, a medieval mixtape of bodily fluids. The doctors swore governed everything from your moods to your muscle twitches. Too much blood, you might be prone to overheating, frenzy, or in this case, full-body interpretive dance. Too much black bile, that meant melancholy, which, bizarrely, might also result in dancing if the stars were misaligned or your soul had been singed just right. What time is it on your side of the night? Drop it in the comments. If your eyes are still open, just the air, invisible poison that floated through cities, especially in the summer, especially when crops rotted and bodies weren't buried quite fast enough. It was believed to crawl into nostrils and settle in the brain, curdling thought and corrupting the nerves. This theory was favored by those who noticed the dancers all seemed to congregate near the same open squares and alleys. Surely the air there had turned sinister. There's something strangely comforting in knowing that, even in the stillness, we're all connected tiny flickers of awareness, glowing softly in the dark. One enterprising soul hung fish guts above his doorway, hoping the stench would repel whatever spirit or gas had infected the neighborhood, not of the body, but of the soul, that the afflicted were touched by forces beyond comprehension, that someone, perhaps a jealous neighbor, or a scorned woman, or an old man who didn't attend Mass often enough, had summoned a curse upon the town, that the dancing was punishment for sin. Yes, but also vengeance. Human vengeance. This led to quiet exorcisms, quiet purges. No official records of executions remain, but it's very likely that more than a few were punished, not for dancing, but for being suspiciously unaffected. Angels? Maybe. Demons? Probably. Or worse, something in between. An inhuman music playing just beneath the veil of our reality, and certain people were unfortunate enough to hear it, because people genuinely believed that the disease could be outrun, outworlded, or at least outperformed. All it did was attract cats, that perhaps Saint Vitus, or some lesser-known celestial being, had chosen Strasbourg for a heavenly spectacle, a city-wide sermon delivered through cramping calves and bleeding heels. When the dust began to settle in Strasbourg, what a grim, grimy dust. It was people did what people always do after something horrible and unexplainable happens. They tried to explain it, and what they knew in 1518 was a tangled web of old ideas dressed up as medicine, not by fire, not by flood, but by dance, a rhythmic reckoning, a grotesque reminder that God could make you move, even if you didn't want to, that the dancing was just one tremor in a crumbling reality, that this was only the beginning. A physician worth his salt, and they did, indeed, prescribe saltwood, consult the position of the planets before diagnosing anything more serious than a stubbed toe. There were treatises written about lunar interference in the human temperament, structured movement, sanctioned dancing, music therapy. Before that was a real thing. The idea was that if you controlled the rhythm, if you gave the compulsion a container, it would eventually burn itself out. A tangled interpretation of Scripture had it that the daughter of her who danced before him to secure John the Baptist's head had cursed dance itself, and now this ancient spiritual debt was being collected. With interest, the dancers, in this view, were unwilling avatars of that ancient shame, trapped in a kind of ghostly performance, echoing through time. Every twirl was penance, every collapse a tiny crucifixion. Some even suggested that the moonlight had seeped into the dancers' veins, made their limbs lunatic and their steps moon-maddened. And oh, were the heavens busy that year. You didn't get sick, you became unbalanced, invaded, or punished. You didn't have a condition, you had an affliction, often with cosmic roots. So when entire crowds writhed in rhythm without reason, the explanations naturally followed suit. They weren't simply sick, they were touched, possessed, singled out for something far older than medicine and far more poetic than logic. Some claimed that Mars and Saturn were locked in a furious celestial argument, creating a cosmic tension that trickled down into mortal bodies and made them twitch. Let's start with the classics. The four humus: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Yes, stars mattered too. In 1518, astrology and medicine were less like siblings and more like conjoined twins. The moon was often blamed too. Too full, too close, too nosy, you name it. And then there was air, bad air. They called it miasma. There were attempts to cleanse it, burning rosemary, fumigating homes with sulfur. Some healers insisted it was a spiritual imbalance. This theory had its appeal. It gave the horror a kind of poetry, a sense of purpose, and it allowed people to point fingers. Because if it was possession, then someone must have invited the devil in. That's when things turned uglier. Rumors began to swirl about witches. Always the witches. And then there was the theory that remains, to this day, the most paradoxically medieval of them all. They believed that dancing could cure the dancing. That's right. Some physicians, faced with people collapsing from constant movement, suggested the solution was. That's what led to those hired musicians. 2 stages. 2 policies that looked like parodies of healthcare. You can imagine how well that went. A few monks posited that the dancers were not cursed, but blessed, consumed by divine rapture, that their movements were not madness, but misunderstood miracles. Of course, this theory fell apart the moment someone died foaming at the mouth, midst others leaned into divine punishment. That Strasbourg, bloated with sin and arrogance, had been selected for a purge, and finally, some simply said, "The world is ending." Because when faced with horror, the dozen T behaved dozen. T knock politely before entering the mind or body. Sometimes it is easier to believe that everything is coming apart at once. It wasn't, of course. The world kept spinning. The stars kept glowing coldly above, and the theories kept coming, each one a fragile mask, trembling over something vast, unknowable, and still dancing in the dark. The medieval mind did not separate body from spirit the way we do now. One particularly Baroque theory claimed that the dancers were reliving the sin of Herod. Yes, that Herod biblical villain and baby killer. A tangled interpretation of scripture had it that the daughter of Herodias, who danced before him to secure John the Baptist's head, had cursed dance itself. These weren't just tools, they were temptations, echoes of pagan rites that had never quite died, merely gone underground, and now a Strasbourg burned under the summer sun, and the people starved and ached and broke. Those echoes grew louder. No, the Hysteria explanation began to form, whispered by men with beards and robes and entirely too much authority, that Frau Treffia was a kind of Eve, apple in hand, hip in motion, dragging everyone else into ecstatic damnation, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Better to be seen twitching in rhythm than to be accused of summoning it. It implies that the plague was part illusion, part contagion, and part performance, all stitched together with fear, that the mind, when pressed hard enough, will do anything to avoid being noticed for the wrong reasons, even if that means joining a dance that might kill you. Better to collapse from mimicry than to be dragged away for heresy. He wrote that they moved with the seriousness of worship, their faces pale but determined. The dancing plague of 1518 defied all boxers. It did not behave. Bloodstains, and a silence that felt too loud. It did not resolve. It slipped through the fingers of science and religion alike, as if trying to dance through a veil none of us could see. And when asked why, they continued, even when blood spilled from their shoes, many had no answer. You see, there was a moment, brief and strange, when not dancing became suspicious. Didn't fall, just kept spinning in a circle, controlled, even calm, eyes open, mouth closed. He called it grace in madness. Plague. and spiritual panic. What better refuge than surrender? What better resistance than rhythm? When standing still in a sea of motion made you the outlier, the threat, there were sermons about it. Quiet ones, righteous ones, the kind that drew a crowd but left no written record. After all, no one wants to admit they believed the uterus could cause spontaneous choreography. But oh, they believed it. Women, they insisted, were naturally more susceptible to emotional excess. Between agony and trance, was it suffering or escape? Their wombs floated, their thoughts fluttered, their bodies were ruled by tides and madness. That primal beat, forgotten by the clergy but remembered by the bones, emerged from the shadows. If anything, like the dancers themselves, the explanations just spun around and around, desperate for direction, craving a beat to follow, but never quite finding stillness. They multiplied. Some clung to the possession narrative, others pivoted to poison. A few simply shook their heads and muttered about God's mysterious will. But none of them ever fit. Not really. A drumbeat that no one consciously heard, but that the body recognized like an old, terrible lullaby. And now, this ancient spiritual debt was being collected with interest. The dancers, in this view, were unwilling avatars of that ancient shame, trapped in a kind of ghostly performance, echoing through time. Every twirl was penance, every collapse a tiny crucifixion. Others pointed fingers at musical instruments, themselves particularly the flute and the drum. And if all else failed, there was always the fallback answer. It's women, because when in doubt, blame women. It didn't matter that men were collapsing just as hard, or that this had started with a single woman in midst. Some went as far as to suggest that the women had seduced the town into dancing, as also evidence that the more dancers there were, the more likely people were to join them, not because they were compelled, which meant some people might have begun to dance as a kind of social camouflage. This theory of performative madness is haunting. One report, written by a monk who visited Strasbourg weeks after the worst had passed, described the dancers not as frantic but as devoted. He described one woman who danced even as her ankle broke, the foot bending sideways with each step. She didn't cry out, and maybe that's the scariest part, that these weren't always flailing limbs or wild eyes, that sometimes the dancing looked beautiful, that maybe, just maybe, there was a kind of peace in it. This blurred the lines between punishment and pleasure, because in a world teetering between starvation, as the months passed and the dancing slowly dwindled, the theories did not. And so, because in the end, and it left behind no clear truth, only footprints, there is something undeniably haunting about joy taken too far. A laugh that doesn't stop becomes a scream. A party that never ends starts to feel like a trap. And dancing so beautiful, so alive, becomes a horror when it won't let go. Strasbourg midsummer, the sun beat down like a punishment, the cobbled streets shimmered with heat. And still the dancers moved. Not in time to music anymore, not in celebration. This was something else. Their feet blistered and broke, ankles twisted, toes split open. Some wore through their shoes, and then their skin, until it was raw and pulpy and blackened with grime. They did not stop, could not stop, could barely speak. Eyewitnesses claimed their eyes were glassy, staring at nothing, mouths slack. Some wept as they danced, some mumbled prayers, others laughed, though no one found it funny. A few spoke in tongues, a few foamed at the mouth, but most simply endured. Musicians played on, trying to tame the madness with melody. The town that had once gathered to witness the madness now recoiled from it. There was a scent in the air, not of perfume or incense, but sweat, blood, and fear. But the dancers didn't move to that music anymore. They moved to something deeper, something private. One fiddler reportedly dropped his instrument mid-song and ran, screaming that he could feel the music inside his own bones, that he dreamed of dancing, that it would take him next. Again, some suggested walling off the dancers, literally building fences around them, letting them whirl themselves into oblivion like cursed animals. Others proposed mass pilgrimages, sending the afflicted on a journey to beg mercy at the shrine of St. Vitus, a journey most of them would never finish, a rhythm that pulsed inside them like a second heartbeat, because endurance had become the only thing left. Their backgrounds meant nothing, only the rhythm mattered now, or rather, the inability to escape it. Her parents tried to restrain her. Her brothers carried her inside, tied her wrists. People whispered more quietly, crossed themselves more often, avoided the market squares and alleyways where the worst had occurred. You could almost see the ghost of movement lingering their shadows, spinning in the corner of your eye, slowly, sullenly. No dramatic end, just less. Fewer people twitching, fewer bodies swaying. More silence, more stillness. Some dancers woke from their trance as if startled, others faded into delirium, never quite recovering their speech or memories. A few were said to have forgotten how to walk entirely. But she writhed free. That night, she slipped from the window, barefoot and bleeding, and joined the crowd again. Doctors stood by, baffled. Priests offered blessings, then exorcisms, then silence. Some walked with limps, not from injury, but as if their legs were trying to remember how stillness worked, moving only when necessary. His neighbors said he feared his own footsteps, that even a single misstep might bring the rhythm back. You can almost hear it between the lines. The quiet avoidance of music, the way people twitched at the sound of footsteps on stone, how a marketplace might grow still the moment someone clapped off beat. Others developed tremors, or became mute, or wandered off into the countryside without a word, as if still trying to dance their way into peace, when a strange communal nightmare tipped over into genuine grief. Pages and pages detailing the plague, the names of the dead, the timeline, the aftermath. Others think it was deliberate suppression, a kind of municipal amnesia. Who wants to remember that your entire city lost control in the most theatrical way possible? But no, history, like the dancers themselves, seems to lose breath. The records trail off. Details blur. How do you describe something that has no precedent, no diagnosis, no moral? How do you explain dozens of people moving to a beat no one hears, day after day, until they die. Even the city archives so surely diligent to the point of obsession go, oddly silent, no tales of reunions, or healing, or grateful silence. It's as if they disappeared, folded into the fog of history, or perhaps they chose not to speak of it again. Because it's one thing to watch your neighbors leap and twist, still wondering. The mystery faded into dread. The theories collapsed under the weight of the bodies. Even the clergy stopped. So what was there left to say when prayer failed and bodies stacked like broken marionettes? The beauty of a movement unbroken until the body broke. It wasn't rebellion or art or hysteria alone. It was something else, something that lived in the overlap between joy and terror, between music and madness. Bones, muscles, blood, breath, everything joins the quiet choreography. But when that miracle malfunctions, it becomes a slow, exquisite horror. According to some versions, a group of surviving dancers were sent barefoot, bruised, half-starved to the shrine of St. Vitus. There they were blessed with holy water and led around the altar, each of them holding a small figure of the saint. And in Strasbourg, 1518, that horror unfolded every day like a performance. No one had the courage to cancel. It's another to bury them limbs, warped, muscles petrified in final, involuntary spasms. No one can say. Perhaps the plague simply wore itself out, like a fire burning through every available matchstick before flickering into darkness. And then the deaths began. Quietly at first. A man stumbled, fell, did not rise. A woman collapsed mid-spin, her face twisted in what might have been ecstasy or agony. It was hard to tell. Another slumped in a corner, still twitching long after her breath had stopped. Exhaustion, heat stroke, heart failure, ruptured vessels. Some literally danced until their bodies gave out like overworked engines. Muscles seized, organs failed, limbs stopped answering the call. There were no dramatic collapses. Was it sin? Was it sickness? Or something worse, something no priest, doctor, or poet could explain? Just a slow thinning of the crowd, one by one, two by two. The records, such as they were, remain vague, but the fear became very real, and it spread faster than the dance itself. They died the way they danced without permission. No one knows how many were lost. Dozens, certainly. Possibly more. Neighbors stopped watching. Families closed their shutters. No one brought water anymore. No one lit candles in the square. Even the musicians began to falter. What had started as civic duty became something far darker. Whether he was right, no one wanted to find out. The city officials, faced with dying citizens and no solution, panicked. Meanwhile, the dancers danced. Children, mothers, soldiers, tailors, and bakers, and beggars, young and old. One tale, possibly apocryphal, but whispered, often tells of a young girl who joined the dance on a Sunday morning, smiling, skipping. By Tuesday, she was gone. Her father claimed she never stopped smiling, not even as her legs gave way. And this is the part of the plague that stings most sharply. The moment when what began as bizarre turned tragic. Funerals were brief, sometimes skipped. What words could be said? What rites could be offered for someone who danced themselves to death? The town, already weary from hunger and plague and religious tension, buckled under the added weight of this strange new morning. And then, finally, the crowds began to thin. The dancing, after reaching its fever pitch, began to die the way a storm does, and some perhaps most simply vanished from the record, as though history, too, was too tired to follow their story to its end. But the streets remembered. The stone held the echoes, and those who witnessed it could never forget the sight of joy turned monstrous. When the human body moves, it's a miracle of cooperation. As more dancers fell, the townspeople began to whisper less about why it was happening and more about when it would stop. There are reports that those who survived were never quite the same. One man, perhaps fictional, perhaps not, was said to have built himself a tiny wooden box outside town and lived there for the rest of his life. The psychological damage, though never recorded in the language of psychiatry, lingers in the stories. It wasn't just the dancers who were affected. It was everyone. And here's where it grows stranger. You'd expect a flood of chronicling, right? Some scholars suspect embarrassment. It may also be that they simply didn't have the language. You don't. You whisper. You wait. You hope it doesn't happen again. There's one final story often told about the end of the dancing plague. The dance stopped after that, or so the legend says. But whether it was faith, exhaustion, or fear that ended it, there are no final records of those who returned, which leaves us, centuries later, standing in the aftermath, still blinking. What were they running from or toward? What rhythm gripped their hearts so fiercely? And what kind of hunger drives a person to move until there is nothing left but blood and breath and finally absence? The dancing plague defies the usual categories. It wasn't war. It wasn't disease, not in the way we understand it. A death not by sword, nor sickness, nor sin, but by motion. And in that it remains almost beautiful. A dark kind of ballet, a poem written in broken feet and frantic silence, and perhaps, just perhaps, a reminder that the body can be haunted just as thoroughly as the mind. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that the cause of all this was far less mysterious than it seemed. No courses, no demons, no divine disco, except rye has a secret. Under the right conditions, it can harbor a guest, a tiny, toxic guest, a fungus, claviceps purpurea, to be precise, just bread, innocent, familiar, crusty on the outside, Holy on Sunday's bread, but not just any bread. We're talking rye grain of the people, hearty and dependable, like something you'd keep in a spice rack. But ergot is not friendly. Victims reported a searing, internal heat, burning hands, tingling skin. Some described it as their veins catching fire. Others said the devil himself was dancing in their muscles. It is the villain in this tale of twisted limbs and poisoned joy. A parasite that grows on damp rye in wet, humid conditions, like say Alsace in 1518, during a particularly miserable summer. In high doses, they can trigger hallucinations, eerily similar to those produced by modern psychedelics. Picture an entire town microdosing chaos, not by choice, but by necessity. In fact, if you've ever heard of LSD, you've already heard of erg. That's where it comes from. Lysergic acid diethylamide was first synthesized in 1938 from a derivative of ergot fungus. We know it today by a much more memorable name. Stores of grain, what little there were, would have been stretched thin, poorly stored, damp from the summer rains. It was compelling. It still is. Desperate bakers may have milled it anyway. People were starving. They weren't picky, and so, possibly, in their hunger, they consumed not just nourishment, but their stomachs became the stage. And the ergot, the choreographer, it's a neat, scientific answer. One that lets us close the case, brush our hands, and move on. And more like contagion of the mind. Yet, in Strasbourg, the phenomenon moved like a fever. Seizures, yes. Pain, yes. Madness, certainly. But this looked like ritual, like a fever dream with choreography. One woman began in July. Then, over the course of days and weeks, others joined, sometimes even from different parts of the city. The people of Strasbourg, while desperate, weren't completely unaware of food safety. Mouldy bread smelled bad, tasted worse. It was often thrown out, even in lean times. And while ergot can be subtle, it leaves sin's dark purple sclerosia visible in the grain. Bakers would have noticed. Some might have refused to use it. A few certainly would have fallen ill in other ways, long before dancers filled the streets. A kind of domino effect. Not all at once, but a slow cascade. People who hadn't shared a meal, a baker, or even a neighborhood. But madness. Not fainting, not mass hysteria in the form of religious ecstasy or self-flagellation or vomiting blood or other far more medieval options. Sounds friendly, doesn't it? It fits in color and texture, but not shape. The timing aligns. A town desperate, a harvest rotting. We'd expect vomiting, burning skin, the loss of fingers and toes from gangrene. People writhing in agony, not just rhythm. If ergot was involved, perhaps it was only part of the stage dressing. A prop, a prompt. The match, not the fire. But the Strasbourg dancers weren't described as sick in that way. They didn't foam or flail at least not at first. They danced tirelessly. Many seemed oddly lucid, even as their feet gave out. Even the location makes sense. Other parts of Europe had seen outbreaks of ergot poisoning before, and would again. It was common enough to be feared enough to earn its own saints. When consumed, even in small doses, ergot can wreak absolute havoc on the human body. We're not talking mild indigestion or a passing headache. We're talking full-blown hallucinations, convulsions, crawling skin, burning limbs, gangrene, and yes, uncontrollable movement. Ergotism, as it's called, has two flavors, depending on how the body processes it. The first is convulsive. Ergotism marked by spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and manic behavior. The second is gangrenous. Ergotism where blood vessels constrict, limbs blacken, and tissue dies off while you're still very much alive. Centuries before science caught up, People simply called it St. Anthony's fire, and with good reason. Now, let's return to Strasbourg. A famine year. It fits, doesn't it? The symptoms match. Twitching, seizures, hallucinations, repetitive motion. And here's where it gets even stranger. Ergot contains alkaloid compounds that interact with neurotransmitters in the brain. So yes, there is a real biological path from moldy rye to full-blown dance mania. The theory gained serious traction in the 20th century when historians and scientists began putting two and two together. Old accounts of spasms, visions, burning limbs, and compulsive dancing with the known effects of ergot poisoning. But here's the twist. It might not explain everything, because as much as the ergot theory covers, it also leaves cracks in the story. Cracks wide enough to dance through. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that everyone in Strasbourg did eat the same cursed loaf, but it doesn't quite hold. For one thing, ergot doesn't work like that. If an entire population consumed enough contaminated rye to cause mass hallucinations, we'd expect more than just dancing. And then there's the issue of spread. Ergot poisoning, unlike a contagious disease, doesn't jump from person to person. It affects those who eat the same toxic batch. That feels less like poisoning. And while ergot has caused outbreaks before, often mistaken for demonic possession, no less there are no other known cases where it inspired, coordinated, prolonged dancing. Even the very idea of eating spoiled rye raises questions. Then there's this. Why not dozens of other towns suffering through the same climate, the same famine, the same bad bread, and why dancing, not shrieking? Why movement? Here the ergot theory begins to fall apart, not because it's wrong necessarily, but because it's incomplete. Like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong corner. There's something too specific, too poetic about what happened in Strasbourg. Too theatrical, too human, and that leads us to a larger, more slippery question. What if the cause wasn't biological at all? What if the body didn't lead the dance? What if the mind did? Because if bad bread isn't enough to explain it, then perhaps we need to look beyond the bakery. Perhaps it wasn't something in the rye. Perhaps it was something in the air, or in the soul, or in the deep coiled places inside the human mind where fear lives quietly. And sometimes that outlet looks like grief. Sometimes it looks like prayer. And sometimes, under the wrong sky, with the wrong hunger, in the wrong town, it looks like a woman stepping into the street and moving her feet to no music at all, and everyone else following, because suddenly it makes a terrible, inexplicable kind of sense. If bread didn't do it, and neither did the devil, then we're left with a quieter villain. One that doesn't leave bruises or fungal spores, one that slips in through locked doors and sleeps beside you like a shadow. It juggles language, breath, memory, and regret with only the occasional panic attack or sleep paralysis demon. But it's not invincible, and under the right pressure, with the right fears, in the right miserable corner of history, it cracks. Let's talk about the mind. Now, to be clear, the human brain is a miracle of wet electricity and dumb luck. The theory of mass hysteria, or more academically, Mass psychogenic illness is not about faking. It's not about liars or attention seekers. It's about stress, trauma, and the way human beings, especially in tight, tense communities, can physically express psychological pain without meaning to, without understanding, without any clear warning. This isn't metaphor. It's not poetry. It's real. A population weakened by hunger and afraid of invisible forces in wrath, disease, dancing, not joyfully, not socially, wildly alone, compelled. People watched. They didn't know what they were seeing, but they felt it. Superstition wasn't a hobby. It was survival. And fear didn't just sit in the background. It sang in the street, not through blood or breath, but attention, witnessing, repetition. The crowd doesn't cure it, confirms. We have the receipts, just not the comforting kind. Within days, the entire school was consumed. Some laughed until they fainted. Others cried while laughing, begged for it to stop. Teachers tried to intervene. Nothing worked. The school closed. When it reopened, the laughter started again. Start with 1518. Strasbourg was primed for a breakdown. Famine, plague, spiritual dread, political instability, villagers, too. Over 1,000 people, all pulled into the strange rhythm of involuntary joy, misplaced and terrifying. Now add in a woman, Frau Trafia, or someone like her. And then one person joined her, then another, and another. Why? Deeply, inconveniently social. We mirror pain, copy behavior, respond to emotional cues we don't even consciously notice. A single yawn in a room can spread like the plague. A cough can spark a chorus. A tremor, a giggle, a danced speech can serve as a beacon to someone else's unspoken distress. Yes, meowing, dozens of nuns, sometimes entire orders, crawling on all fours and howling like cats. Not for hours, for weeks. The clergy attempted exorcisms. Some were beaten, others locked away. The behavior eventually stopped, but not because of prayer or reason. It stopped when no one could afford to look anymore. Bravely walking through history with our own minds, our own choices, immune to the swarm. But the truth is, humans are group animals. Our minds are not walled cities. They're open markets, porous and humming. In Strasbourg, that form was movement, sudden, insistent, repetitive. It spread, not because it was understood, but because it was felt. On some primal, aching level, it made sense to the people who joined. Their own bodies were already screaming. This just gave it shape. We absorb what we see, what we hear, what others feel. Because fear spreads, because the line between empathy and infection is thinner than we'd like to admit. Add heat, add fear, add hunger. Their bodies were spelling out the sentence the whole town was afraid to say. We re not okay. In the Middle Ages, it was dancers, meowing nuns, biting frenzies, religious ecstasies. They moved. They collapsed without warning. No pathogen was found, nothing in the air, no chemicals, and yet it kept happening. It needs an audience, or rather, it needs belief, not in the cause, necessarily, but in the feeling that the only way to survive a world out of control was to lose control yourself. in public, with others. The tension, the shared knowing that something is wrong, even if no one can name it. For others, it looked like violence, and for a fevered summer in 1518, in a cobbled Alsatian town dripping with hunger and guilt, it looked like rhythm. Nor was it the first. It sits on a long, winding path through history, marked by the footsteps of people who couldn't explain what was happening inside them, so they made it visible. That the only way to survive a world out of control was to lose control yourself out in the open, with others. Think of the feeling after a tragedy, a school shooting, a natural disaster, an act of violence. How people gather, how they weep, pace, reach for one another. How rituals emerge, almost instinctively. Candles, songs, chants, movement, repetition. It's not so different, just less medieval. That is not nonsense. That is not superstition. That is not failure. It's human. That trauma can be logged, processed, therapized into dust. It sits on a long, winding path through history, marked by the footsteps of people who couldn't explain what was happening inside them, so they made it visible. For some, that looked like prayer. For others, it looked like violence. And for one fevered summer in 1518, in a cobbled Alsatian town dripping with hunger and guilt, it looked like rhythm, out of sync with the world, yet perfectly in step with something deeper, something broken, something beautifully, terribly human. But the body remembers. The body keeps the score, as they say. And sometimes, when it can't speak, it dances. Only after the media stopped reporting it did the symptoms vanish. Not because people were lying, but because the story had no place to live anymore. Their bodies were spelling out the sentence. The whole town was too afraid to say, "We're not okay." And instead of resting, they moved, and they kept moving, until their feet bled, their bodies collapsed, their breath stopped. In more modern times, it becomes twitching in a classroom. But belief, oh, it had belief in abundance. Belief that the saints punished sin. Belief that dancing could be a cure. Belief that demons walked beside you in the heat of July, and that the stars could tilt your blood into madness. Fainting in a factory, skin rashes in an office where no chemical ever leaked, and the trembling of hands at mealtime. But belief, oh, it had belief in abundance. Because when one body breaks the rules of movement of control, it gives others permission, or perhaps it acts as a mirror. If there's no release valve, it spills over. Tears, tremors, shouting in your sleep, or, in this case, dancing. I feel that chaos, too, says the onlooker. But beneath the robes and rot, it was grief. Raw and feral and finally moving. My body just didn't know how to say it. Until now. Think of trauma as static in the nervous system. And once it starts, it spreads. This isn't just theory. We've seen it again and again. In the 1960s, a school in Tanzania was overtaken by an outbreak of contagious laughter. It began with a few girls giggling uncontrollably, and it didn't stay contained. Other schools were affected. Laughter, in that case, was not happiness. It was grief with its mouth open. Or take the nuns. In the 15th and 16th centuries, convents across Europe recorded outbreaks of meowing. The human brain is social. In Strasbourg, the pressure was everywhere. Failing crops, bodies in the street, sermons full of wrath, hungry children, rumors of curses, wars, and saints. Then give that tension a visual outlet, a person whose body says what everyone else can't. And suddenly, it doesn't seem so strange. The dance, the spread, the silence afterward, it was collective trauma given legs. And like all good trauma, it wore the costume of the time. Fear of God, fear of witches, fear of sin, because the mind can only hold so much. And when it cracks, sometimes it cries, sometimes it meows, and sometimes it dances. We like to think of ourselves as individuals, and in times of fear, that permeability becomes dangerous. Mass psychogenic illness doesn't look like reason. It looks like whatever form the body can grab onto. There are documented examples across time, each dressed in the costumes of their century. In the 1980s, an outbreak of fainting spells in the West Bank affected hundreds of schools. And that's the uncomfortable heart of mass psychogenic illness. Strasbourg didn't have Twitter, it had word of mouth, church bells, whispers, belief that the saints punished sin, belief that dancing could be a cure, belief that demons walked beside you in the heat of July, and that the stars could tilt your blood into madness. They were mirrors, and instead of resting, and kept moving, until their feet bled, their bodies collapsed, their breath stopped. Imagine a town so overwhelmed by stress and hunger and fear that it literally couldn't sit still. That grief had to become kinetic. Strasbourg may have been one of the most dramatic cases, but it wasn't the last. For some, that looked like prayer, out of sync with the world, but perfectly in step with something deeper, something broken, something beautifully, terribly human. Strasbourg didn't have Twitter. It had word of mouth, church bells, whispers, and the trembling of hands at mealtime. The dancers weren't rebels. They were mirrors. Imagine a town so overwhelmed by stress and hunger and fear that it literally couldn't sit still. That grief had to become kinetic. Even now, in the clean, fluorescent corners of modern life, the echoes remain. We like to believe that we are past this, that we've transcended the messy mechanics of the mind. Strasbourg may have been one of the most dramatic cases, but it wasn't the last, nor was it the first. Eventually, the music stopped, or at least the sound of feet on stone faded. No one knows the exact day it ended, because no one announced it. There was no ceremony, no sudden revelation, no collective sigh of relief. Just a gradual hush. Town exhausted, a strange quiet settling over the cobbled streets like dust after a storm. The dancers stopped. One by one or they fell, too weak to move. Those who survived returned home, if they had homes to return to. Many were taken to the shrine of St. Vitus, carried or dragged, because someone still believed in sacred geography. The church, for all its confusion and contradiction, remained one of the few places where hysteria was allowed a name. There, at the shrine, they prayed. Some were wrapped in red shoes and made to walk in a slow, controlled spiral, a ritual not of celebration, but of containment. Not everyone recovered. Strasbourg tried to move on, as towns do. Records don't dwell on it. Most official documents speak of the event in the way one might speak of bad weather or a failed harvest briefly. Vaguely, with a touch of embarrassment. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. Too raw. The kind of thing that, when spoken of too often, makes the air feel heavier. Some say the dancers were ashamed. Others say the town was. Both are probably true. When grief becomes visible, when it spills out into the street and starts waving its arms around, it's hard to look at. It's harder still when that grief wears your neighbor's face, or your mother's, or yours. It's easier to pretend it never happened. Easier to patch the hole in the street than the hole in the psyche. And so Strasbourg buried it. Not literally, the dead had already been buried, but symbolically, the way people bury anything too strange to fold into the standard narrative of history. It wasn't taught in schools. It didn't become a solemn holiday or a cautionary tale. It became a ghost. Still, echoes remained. Some whispered about it when someone else behaved oddly. Like the dancing days, they might say, under their breath. Others simply remembered the feeling, not the facts, but the atmosphere, that hot, heavy air, that thudding dread, the sense that something had been let loose and then quietly locked away again. There's a particular stillness after madness, a kind of emotional vacuum. Not peace, exactly. More like numbness, like a town collectively holding its breath, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. And for those who had danced, the aftermath was its own kind of exile. Some likely never recovered their health. Others may have struggled with what we'd now call trauma, though they had no words for it. How do you explain a month you spent moving against your will? How do you describe a grief that borrowed your muscles and made a spectacle of your suffering? Perhaps that's why they didn't speak of it, not because they wanted to forget, but because they couldn't explain. What do you say after your own body betrays you in public? After your neighbors watched your collapse and called it divine punishment, or madness, or a spectacle? How do you come back from being the town's mystery? So instead, they didn't. They didn't talk about it. They didn't write it down in any detail. And history, like a polite visitor, followed suit. It turned the volume down, let the candles burn out, and allowed the silence to settle back in. But silence is not absence. It's just another kind of noise, softer, easier to ignore. Beneath that quiet, the questions lingered. What did it mean? Could it happen again? Was it spiritual, medical, social? No one could say for sure. But everyone, in some buried way, remembered. Even centuries later, the story leaks out. Not because people want to sensationalize it or stretch it into something. It wasn't, but because the mind doesn't forget movement that came from pain. And Strasbourg never danced like that again. Not in the streets. Not out loud. What's strangest about the aftermath is not that the dancing stopped, but how quickly everything around it tried to pass, as if the town had collectively blinked, shaken off the fever, and agreed never to speak of it again. No long sermons, no stone carvings, no public records detailing the trauma. The dancing plague, so vivid in its madness, disappeared into the folds of time like a dream you half remember after waking. You know it happened, but the moment you try to explain it, the words vanish. In some ways, this silence was more haunting than the event itself. After all, Strasbourg had never been quiet about other disasters. They documented famines, invasions, and outbreaks of real, tangible diseases with clerical precision. But a street full of bodies, writhing in sync, led by invisible music, that didn't fit in the margins of any ledger. So it lived elsewhere in shadowed corners, in murmured prayers, in the uneasy pause between songs, The few who dared to record it did so with distance. Medical texts turned it into a curiosity, a case study, something to analyze like a fever chart. They used careful words: mania, epidemic, hysteria. They diagrammed what had once been raw agony, but they didn't tell you what the dancers saw behind their eyes. They didn't describe the way the sun must have burned their skin as they twitched on the cobbles, or the hollow look in someone's face after 3 days without sleep. Those parts were too soft, too human. In the rare accounts that survived, there is no mention of names, no lists of those who danced. Frau Traffia began the story, but even she fades by the end. No heroes, no villains, no survivors giving interviews. Just silence. And yet, the town changed. It must have. Not every wound scars the same way. Some leave thick, visible marks. Others run deeper beneath memory, beneath language. Strasbourg carried it the way many places carry a shared trauma, with quiet shifts. Maybe people walked faster. Maybe they prayed differently. Maybe mothers held their children a little tighter when the summer sun grew heavy. The change wasn't in what they said. It was in what they didn't. You can feel this kind of change in many places. Towns that lived through siege. Islands where children vanished. Villages rebuilt after fire. They look normal. But if you stay long enough, if you listen carefully, the silence starts to hum. Strasbourg hummed too. There's something beautiful in that, and something deeply unsettling. That people endured, that life went on, that the same streets where bodies had collapsed were swept, walked, rebuilt, but also that what happened there could be erased with such precision. Not even out of malice, just discomfort. Just the way people turn from what they don't understand. And yet, the story didn't vanish entirely. It drifted, became folklore, a whispered legend for those who needed metaphors. It became the sort of tale told around firelight or tucked into the footnotes of medical books: the dancing plague, the laughing nuns, the biting epidemics, a collection of curious things that made the world briefly surreal. But for those who were there, for those who moved until their muscles gave out, it wasn't metaphor. It wasn't madness. It was life. Strange, unspoken, unstoppable life. Today, the streets of Strasbourg are quiet. Tourists pass through, often unaware. Cafes line the cobblestones. Children laugh in the sun. Music, when it plays, is safe, contained, pleasant, but beneath it all, the memory remains. Not a ghost, exactly. Not a haunting. More like a breath held too long, a note left hanging in the air. Because once, not so long ago, a town tried to forget the way grief danced and failed. Strasbourg wasn't an isolated case. It was strange, yes, intense, absolutely, but unique. Not even close. Long before 1518 and long after, history has shuffled and twirled with its own list of inexplicable outbreaks. Events where the body seemed to slip its leash, where movement or sound or laughter or trembling spread like wildfire, untethered from logic. Strasbourg may have made it into the darker corners of European textbooks, but its rhythm echoed elsewhere across time, across cultures, in ways just as haunting, just as human. Let's begin a little south, in Italy, specifically in the sun-baked heel of the boot, where something called tarantism plagued the region for centuries. And no, it wasn't just an adorable fear of spiders. Tarantism was believed to be the result of a venomous bite from the Lycosa tarantula, a local wolf spider. The legend went like this: if you were bitten, your body would fall into an uncontrollable fit of dancing, convulsions, and bizarre behavior. The only cure? More dancing, Musicians would be summoned. Families would gather. The afflicted would be encouraged to move wildly, passionately, until sweat poured and exhaustion dulled the venom's imagined grip. It wasn't a private affliction. It was a performance. A ritual. A strange and public sort of healing. Entire festivals formed around it. The music, known as the tarantella, was upbeat and relentless. People danced in circles, arms flailing, bodies spinning in tempo with something ancient and unnamed. Modern historians now question whether spider bites had anything to do with it at all. Most suspect it was another form of mass psychogenic illness. Stress, trauma, repression, all conveniently filtered through folklore and given permission to erupt, as dance and the spider, just a story to make it all feel safer. Move east, and the rhythm doesn't stop, it just shifts. In the 15th and 16th centuries, German-speaking Europe experienced more than one dancing mania. Some outbreaks involved dozens of people, sometimes hundreds, overtaken by motion they could not resist. In one case, it was said a group of people danced on a bridge until the structure collapsed, drowning several participants in the water below. The stories sound eerily familiar. The heat, the crowds, the fear, the confusion, the inability to explain what was happening, paired with the desperate urge to assign it meaning. But dance wasn't the only symptom that caught and spread like fire. In 1518's broader family of contagious behavior, we also find the strange case of the meowing nuns. Yes, that's not a metaphor. On a French convent, a single nun began to meow, loudly, repeatedly, and then others joined her. One by one, the convent became filled with women who meowed in unison daily, hourly, as if possessed by the same feline force. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, it was deeply troubling. The surrounding villagers were terrified. Priests were called. Eventually, the behavior was suppressed through harsh discipline, but not before the sounds of communal meowing echoed through those sacred halls. Or take the laughing epidemic of 1962 in what is now Tanzania. It began in a boarding school with just a few students. A sudden fit of laughter with no clear cause. Harmless at first, but it spread. From girl to teachers, to other schools, and eventually into villages. At its peak, thousands were affected. Not just laughter, but crying, fainting, respiratory issues. Schools closed. Parents panicked. Officials were baffled. The event lasted months. No cause was ever identified. Just laughter. So much laughter, it hurt. There have been others, biting outbreaks, trembling frenzies, fainting spells sweeping through factory lines or cloisters. The symptoms change. The settings shift. But the patterns remain. High-stress environments, vulnerable groups, and a shared psychological pressure looking for a waning weight to escape. It's not always illness. Sometimes it's worship. In many cultures, movement, rhythm, trance, they aren't signs of affliction. They're sacred, a doorway to the divine. From the Sufi whirling dervishes to Pentecostal speaking in tongues, from voodoo possession ceremonies to tribal healing dances, people have long used ecstatic movement to connect with something larger than themselves. Something beyond thought, beyond language. A kind of embodied surrender. What's the difference between a spiritual trance and a hysterical fit? Sometimes just context. Sometimes just the music. Strasbourg may have drawn its own chalk outline in history, but it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a glitch. It was part of a bigger, stranger human story. A story where emotion, belief, and the limits of the body all meet in motion. A story that keeps repeating, in different costumes, in different keys, over and over again. It's tempting to laugh, at the meowing, at the dancing, at the dramatic fainting fits that spread like perfume through medieval convents. But laughter is often the shield we raise when we're brushing too close to something familiar. Because the truth is, we still do this. We still fall into collective rhythms of behavior that don't entirely make sense. We just dress them in different clothes. Think of trends, fads, mobs. Think of the strange, contagious choreography of panic and obsession. A single person panics, and suddenly the whole crowd is running. A single child coughs in a classroom, and a dozen others follow. A celebrity wears something ridiculous, and millions mimic it overnight. We are creatures of mimicry. We mirror, without meaning to. It's wired in. One yawn sets off a dozen. One person cries, and others' throats tighten. We like to believe we are individual islands of thought, but most of the time, we are wave after wave. And yes, sometimes the waves crash in unison. There's a peculiar safety in shared strangeness. One person trembling in grief is unstable, but a whole group trembling, that becomes a ritual, a tradition, a pattern to hold on to when words fail. We see this in stadiums, in protests, in churches, hands lifted in the same direction, voices raised in unison, bodies swaying. Rhythm offers relief, even when it looks a little mad from the outside. That's what makes these historical outbreaks so compelling. Not because they're distant, bizarre relics, but because they reflect us more than we want to admit. In Strasbourg, in Tanzanian schools and French convents, we see pieces of our own nervous systems acting without permission. Grief turned into choreography, confusion turned into sound, and above all, an unwillingness to suffer alone. We also see something else, the power of belief. Not just religious belief, though that played its part, but belief in rules, in authority, in what is allowed to be real. People danced because they thought they had to, because someone told them the only way to stop the pain was to keep moving, because the people around them were doing it, because the world had gotten too quiet, and this made a kind of terrible sense. Belief shaped the illness, directed it, fed it, and eventually quelled it. In some cultures, dance is sacred. In others, it's scandalous. But wherever you go, it means something. And in moments when reality bends and breaks, people have always turned to movement. Not to show off, but to survive. To say, without saying, something is wrong, and I don't know how else to tell you. So, yes, Strasbourg was one story, but it lives in a much longer, weirder anthology. A global scrapbook of twitching, laughing, wailing bodies that said what mouths could not. And isn't it telling that we remember so few of the names? We remember the symptoms, the headlines, the absurdities, but not the people. Not the teenage girl who laughed until her chest ached, not the nun who meowed and got punished for it, not the man who danced for 6 days straight and finally dropped. They become outlines, characters, anomalies, footnotes, but they were real. They had names, they had families, they had reasons we'll never fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. Maybe we're not meant to solve every mystery. Maybe some stories are there to remind us of the limits of our understanding. That sometimes the most honest thing we can do is notice the pattern, honor the strangeness, and sit quietly with the discomfort of not knowing. To accept that the line between sanity and spectacle is not a wallet, a thread. Thin, fragile, and far easier to cross than most of us would like to admit. Because, whether it's a holy trance or a viral video challenge, a laughing fit in a schoolyard or a perfectly synchronized flash mob in a shopping mall, there's something consistent humming underneath. Something deeply human. We are strange creatures. social creatures. Soft machines built not just to think, but to mirror, to respond, to echo. We adapt, we absorb, we repeat. And sometimes, when the world becomes too loud or too quiet, too cruel, or too confusing, when the pressure mounts beyond words, our bodies take over, we move. Not alone, but together. It's easy to leave the dancing plague in the past, to brush it off as a medieval oddity, like bloodletting or leech therapy, or blaming your neighbor's cow for the weather. Something quaint, embarrassing, a glitch in history that couldn't possibly happen now, with our fiber optics and brain scans and cloud backups. But the more you look at it, the more closely you follow those footprints through the dust of Strasbourg's narrow streets, the more it refuses to stay buried. Because, the truth is, the dancing never really ended. Sure, the form changed. The music got slicker. The fear wore new costumes, but the rhythm, still there. Still pulsing underneath everything. Still waiting for a crack in the surface, a breach, a pressure point. It's there in the moments when emotion becomes unbearable and the body steps in. When grief becomes motion, when panic becomes ritual, when joy turns so overwhelming it starts to shake the limbs. It's there in protest marches, funeral processions, raves at the edge of nowhere, churches soaked in sweat and light. It's there in the way we rock ourselves without thinking, the way we tap our feet when we're anxious, the way we find others to move with when language isn't enough. And maybe that's the strangest part of all, how something that seemed like madness now feels familiar. In the 1500s, people were terrified of what they saw. Bodies out of control. Emotions turned loose in public. But underneath that fear was something even deeper. Recognition. The dancers weren't other. They were amplifiers. Their movement mirrored what everyone else was bottling up. The pressure of life too heavy to carry silently anymore. It's why none of the theories ever quite fit. Not ergot, not demons, not punishment from above or poison from below. Because the plague wasn't caused by just one thing. It was many things. Layered, heavy, old, and deeply human. It was a tangle of belief and biology. Of sorrow thick in the summer heat, of famine, gnawing at the edges of faith, and of unspoken needs that had nowhere else to go. And even now, with centuries stretched between us and those sweating dancers on the stone streets of Strasbourg, we still haven't untangled it. We revisit the story not because it offers neat conclusions, but precisely because it doesn't. Because it whispers something fragile and hard to name, yet impossibly loud to ignore, something about what it means to be alive in a world that keeps asking more than we have to give. A world that doesn't always provide stillness, or clarity, or comfort. And so, sometimes, when there's nothing else left, what remains is movement. Not as escape, and not as surrender, but as a kind of prayer through the body. A way of saying, I feel this too, I don't know what to do with it. So I'll let it pass through me, just like they did. Back then, in the unbearable heat, in the choking dust, when the music played only in their minds, but still, was far too loud to ignore, that the strange poetry of it lingers. A town unraveling, not with screams, or fire, or war, but with movement, with feet slapping stone, with limbs that wouldn't stop, with rhythm that had no source and no destination. Just pure, senseless expression that defied the world it came from. And when it finally stopped, when the last dancer collapsed, the music ceased, and the hush settled in. The questions didn't stop with it. They never have. Because the dancing plague of 1518 doesn't belong just to Strasbourg. It belongs to every moment in history when humans broke under pressure and chose something irrational, something beautiful, something strange to survive. It belongs to every community that turned to ritual when words failed. To every body that trembled under the weight of unspoken grief. To every person who felt alone and found comfort in moving like someone else, it belongs to now, too. Because, even today, we chase mystery with microscopes. We want a diagnosis, an explanation, a line drawn neatly under the story with a satisfying aha. But the dancing plague resists that. It asks us to sit in the grey space, to be curious, to let something remain a little wild, a little unsolved. What caused it? Pick your theory. Ergot, hysteria, heatstroke, divine wrath, social stress, neurological disruption. They all sound good until you say them out loud and realize how small they are. None of the explanations truly capture the rhythm. None of them account for why, in the heart of the chaos, people moved together as if they were a single living thing. There's something sacred in that, not necessarily in the religious sense. Though religion certainly played its part, but in the way it touches something deep and unreachable. That soft center where fear lives beside longing, and the need to belong hums beneath the surface. That's what makes us human. Not our logic, not our cleverness or ability to reason, but our vulnerability, our shared strangeness. The quiet, unspoken recognition that sometimes the answer isn't stillness or control, it's surrender, it's sweat, it's movement. The plague eventually ended. The dancers collapsed. Strasbourg returned to its routines, its closed shutters and silent meals. The flailing limbs were replaced with weary silence. The records faded. The whispers dissolved. But the dance, it never really stopped. It appears now in different forms. Less fatal, less medieval perhaps, but just as revealing. We see it after grief, after tragedy, in the way we gather and sing the same songs, light the same candles, wear the same colors. We move together even when we're falling apart. And in that shared motion, we find a strange sort of clarity. We write our pain in rhythm. We give shape to chaos through choreography. We say, without speaking, I don't understand this either. But I'm here. I'm with you. Let's move through it together. That's what the dancers of 1518 did, whether they meant to or not, whether they understood it or not, and maybe that's as close as we'll ever get to an answer. Not a neat theory, not a solution, but a truth that sinks below language. A truth that lingers in the bones, especially in those quiet moments just before sleep. So rest now. Let the noise dim. Let the questions drift gently into silence. And if, in the hush of your thoughts, you feel the faintest urge to SWA, why don't resist it? Let it move through you. The dance hasn't vanished, it's just quieter now. Good night.